Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagano, and we're back here in studio for another fun-filled, action-packed episode of Iowa's favorite Get John Laughing conservative podcast. We have a really big show today, guys. I'm here with John and Chris again, and I've warned them to be ready because we got a lot to cover. So we've got some legislative proposals to work through, some numbers. I know that as soon as we get into numbers and details of things, people really get amped up and fiery, but it's going to be fun. And we also have an interview later in the episode with Daniel Dew from the Pacific Legal Foundation. So a special feature today on that as well. So are you guys ready to go?
Yes.
Good.
Yes. Talking tax rates and heavy data.
Good.
That's good radio. So let's do it.
Okay. Before we go too much further, we need to follow up on something that we covered on the last episode, which was the Florida of the North comment, right? So the idea was that this was a comment among State House reporters,
a derogatory
one, a joke among Iowa State House reporters. This is the claim from the Washington Post, that this is a joke that Iowa has become the Florida of the North. Well, one of the more prominent Iowa State House reporters is Aaron Murphy from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. So he decided to take to Twitter. He's a very prolific Twitter person. And he took to Twitter to kind of clear his name and say, this is absolutely not us, not me. I wouldn't do this. And I think Aaron is, generally a pretty straightforward, a good reporter. But so after he goes on this long defense of clearing the air, there is then a comment from the author of the Washington Post article, Annie Gowan, I guess, who says, hey, wait a minute, this was actually covered on your podcast. Here's
yours, meaning Aaron's.
Aaron. So he hosts, I believe he's the host of it. I used to listen to the On Iowa Politics podcast, but it was just a little too much of the Todd Dorman variety show, and I just couldn't take it anymore.
So we made our own variety show.
Right, exactly. So, I didn't want to listen to Todd Dorman laugh at Republicans. I'd rather start my own and laugh at whoever I want to laugh at, right?
There you go.
So anyway, so there's the comment, and apparently, that was offered. So I would encourage go and listen to the On Iowa Politics podcast and see what you think. Clearly Todd Dorman owns up that he was making this comment, and apparently, that generated much laughter. And so we'll see, but I at least we know who the epicenter is of that problem. But
yep.
So anyway,
well, thank you for the additional investigative digging you did there. Well, so now we know.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. So let's move on to something that I know the three of us have been talking about a lot here in the office over the last couple of days, is two new proposed study bills in the legislature, which are Senate Study Bill 1207 and House Study Bill 232, which are identical bills that propose two new amendments to the Iowa Constitution.
Is it? Two new amendments?
Two distinct ballot questions.
Oh, it would be. Okay.
Yes, contained within, it's one action of the legislature, but there are two ballot questions inside of that. So
I'm glad I showed up for this today.
Yeah,
now I know.
You're learning something. Good. So, John, what do they do? I'm going to let you explain it. I know you've dug in, and we've all talked about it. But what are the two new questions that would hypothetically be given to Iowa voters to put into our Constitution?
Yeah, they're both what we'd consider taxpayer protections that would be placed in the Constitution if adopted. But the first would simply create a 2/3 majority requirement for both houses to pass a tax increase. And we did some digging on this, and about 16 states have some variation of a supermajority requirement. 7 have that in their constitution that specifically require a 2/3 majority. And so that would be the first amendment that's being proposed here. The second one deals with the Taxpayer Relief Fund, which would have language that would have that fund be used for income, sales, and property tax relief.
Yes. Okay. Let's take these one at a time. So yes, clearly they are taxpayer protections, both of them. The 2/3 majority, pretty straightforward, right? You want to raise taxes, it takes 2/3 of the members of the legislature in both chambers to approve it.
Yes,
right?
and this is I would say just a common sense taxpayer protection that several states have, as I mentioned, and basically it just makes it harder for a future legislature to increase taxes.
Yeah. And not a brand new idea, done in other states, done in some blue states, right?
Yes,
Didn't you tell me California has this?
California, I believe Washington, there's other kind of purple states that have it.
It would make me feel better if you told me that was something that was put into law when Ronald Reagan was there, but it probably wasn't. So
I should have looked into that.
Yeah, well, maybe we can do that in the future. Good. Well, look, that's great. The only thing that occurs to me is that, and maybe it's for the good, maybe it's not. If you were in a situation and perish the thought where some tax needed to be raised, who knows, decades down the road, you probably would then need bipartisan support to do whatever you needed to do. That whoever the majority party is would probably have to go to the minority party and say this. And certainly that would make it harder to get a tax increase passed. There's no doubt about it. Now they have 2/3 right now in the state Senate, but not in the House. I think they're just 3 votes short of that. So maybe they're close anyway, but we certainly are in historical highs. So I don't know that would continue. So moving on to the second piece about the Taxpayer Relief Fund. And so I want to explore this a little bit more. So we've had the Taxpayer Relief Fund or some precursor version of it for 10 years now. And the idea being that surplus funds, that excess that's paid in taxes, goes into a special segregated fund for the purpose of tax relief, right?
Specifically, income
tax relief. Yes. It was part of, yes. And that's an important point. So this, and John, what you said, so read the operative if you have it, the operative language there, that it sort of constitutionally creates the Taxpayer Relief Fund and then says that, and maybe we can just paraphrase this, that Taxpayer Relief Fund shall be used only for income tax relief, corporate income tax relief, sales and use tax, and property taxes, which is a broader list of things than has been understood to be the purpose of the Taxpayer Relief Fund.
That's correct. Yeah, okay. Because the original intent of this, it was directed at income tax relief.
Right. And so broad picture, yes, constitutionally defining that as for tax relief is a good thing in very broad brushstrokes. Because we agree with that, right?
Yes, and let's help folks. Thank you. Let's help folks understand that right now, when we have laws that are in code or statute, if you will, a future legislature could undo those things through the normal process and redefine things or take away. And while they don't always want to go against the intent of previous legislatures, it happens. Right. And so by moving this into the Constitution and define this way, it says a future legislature can't just scoop the money and use it for something else. It would be restricted to providing relief on income, sales, and property tax.
Under current law, the next General Assembly that gets seated in 2025 could use the Taxpayer Relief Fund on community recreation centers if they really wanted to.
Don't put that idea in anybody's head.
But we saw attempts at that this session by some of the Democrat lawmakers that wanted to use it.
They wanted to spend it on projects.
Send it to cities.
Use it to backfill cities and counties. I think I want to set that yes, it is a big brushstroke protection of that fund for tax relief. But John, you have some concerns about expanding the list of what it can be used for.
Yes, my first concern is as we already mentioned, the original intent of this was directly for income tax relief for Iowans, and the other problem that's going on, and it's not this, well, in a way it's a problem, but it's actually good. It shows the strength of our economy is the Taxpayer Relief Fund is this year, fiscal year 2023, is going to have $2.7 billion. That's projected to increase to $3 billion. So that's a huge. And let's remember that's taxpayer money. And so my concern is that you open up a door for using that for property tax relief. And I know some people might say, well, why am I saying that? But here's the problem. And we've talked a lot on this program about the reason for high property taxes is local government spending. Without substantial budget limitations placed on local governments, and then you start using the Taxpayer Relief Fund to buy down rates to provide property tax relief, that is going to be basically one-time relief because you're not solving the property tax problem.
You're essentially taking an overpayment of income taxes and sending it to local governments.
That's exactly right.
At least using that to allow local governments to stay on their spending trajectory might be a fair way to say that.
Yes. And so my view would be it would be best to make sure that this fund is used primarily first, protecting that for income tax relief, because otherwise, we've seen other states make this mistake where the state general fund goes down to try to provide property tax relief and it doesn't solve anything. And that's something that needs to be seriously considered.
Yeah. Okay. We haven't completely landed on the same square on this yet. I know this is going to come as a shock to our listeners that the three of us don't always, think as one. I agree with you, but I also think that one of the reasons that the Taxpayer Relief Fund has grown to the level it has is because there's been a reluctance to use it for the same reason. And I'm not disagreeing with you. Maybe this is just a different angle on it, but if you use it to, let's say, offset school funding, you're using a one-time source of money for an ongoing cost. You're an ongoing, the state picks that up. Well, at some point, the state can't use those one-time monies anymore, and now you have to use the general fund to fill that up at the local level.
And you have not systemically gotten around the issue of spending or taxes. And so it's one thing if you use it as a mechanism to deliver ongoing relief. It's another thing if it's a one-time plug.
But I think that's why there's been some reluctance to use that fund in some of the previous income tax bills, because the goal is to have that income tax cut stand on its own.
Correct.
And so now you've got, and here's where I think we need to have a conversation, is what is the plan for the Taxpayer Relief Fund? Now, I think we're all going to agree on this one. Where I really think that has great value is the cushion for driving the elimination of the income tax or another aggressive reduction in the individual income tax, is to have the Taxpayer Relief Fund provide the stability for the state budget as that gets implemented.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we
good.
see
we
this.
Do all agree then. Okay.
Yep.
We see this in the Senate income tax bill that I believe is, I don't know if it has advanced through committee, but basically the bill that Senator Dawson has introduced that would lower the 3.9% flat tax down to 2.5 by 2028, and then use the Taxpayer Relief Fund to slowly eliminate the income tax and sort of use it as a revenue type trigger. To me, that is what goes back to what the original intent of this fund was.
Yes.
And a very appropriate use of the Taxpayer Relief Fund, because the other danger is, I think, my worry is if you start using the fund even to shift away for the state to pick up more education funding, that's still one-time money. And as we've seen what happens with the education budget every year, it goes up. And it may not go up by a large percent depending on what party's in control, but we all know the biggest probably predictability in Iowa politics is that every single fiscal year, public education dollars will increase. And so I think the best way to ensure that taxpayers get that money back is to give it back to taxpayers, not to give it back to more spending.
I have two thoughts, and I think that the dynamics that you're talking about, John, should be part of the conversation and need to be addressed and everything sort of talked through. One thing, what do we do with the Taxpayer Relief Fund if and when the income tax is eliminated, right? So maybe then we do utilize it to bring down other rates, whether it's a one-time or not. I don't know. That's part of it. And then the other thing I'd say is, my guess is, and we're on the foundation side, so we don't talk to legislators. My guess is the intent of some legislators want to do this, frankly, probably matches our own, right? And they're thinking that they will be in control and they will do these things, and it would all be plans that we say are really good. And I think probably the only thing that we're really talking about is we don't know exactly what the circumstances will be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, right? And maybe the legislature will control look differently. And I think that is the concern, is not so much that we think the current iteration of legislators at the Capitol are going to go down a road that we wouldn't be a fan of. It's we want to make sure that whatever is written, whatever is put in place, certainly if it's put into the Constitution, that is going to be the best sort of guidelines or guardrails kind of no matter what. And I think that's really at the heart of what you're saying is there's circumstances down the road where it may not be quite what we'd want it to be.
I think that's a good point. And I think that when you're amending the Constitution, there probably does need to be some flexibility for the legislature in the future to do what they need to do. If you get too prescriptive, and as a reminder, it is really hard to amend the Iowa Constitution.
As it should be.
As it should be. It's often said it should be hard to pass a law. It should be really hard to amend your Constitution. I mean, John, when was the last time the U.S. Constitution was amended?
Oh, that's I'm going to fail that civics question, but it's been a while.
Yeah, yes. Well, and we have amended the state constitution from time to time.
And to look at a basket case of where that's abused is just California, where they're constantly amending it.
So I would have put a plug in for some flexibility in this. And we have a lot of confidence in the current leaders and policymakers at the state level. But as Chris said, you don't know who's there in the future. So I certainly, if that's on the ballot as is, I'm voting for it. I just make that perfectly clear right now. I think it is a very good step. But, maybe there is some language that would tailor that more towards income taxes. I don't know, but
I think my take is I am thrilled that we've got legislators that are putting forth serious proposals for more taxpayer protections. Kudos to all involved in doing that. Then let's also make sure we have our eyes wide open about where this could go in the future as circumstances change a little bit, and we want to make sure it's crafted just as well for those circumstances as they are for the present ones.
For those that don't remember or haven't heard before what the process is to amend the Iowa Constitution. So if these two bills would advance, and keep in mind, they actually don't go to the governor, but it has to pass two consecutive general assemblies, and the General Assembly is the 2-year period. Right?
In identical form.
In identical form for both years.
And both chambers.
In both chambers. So even if they pass it this year, it really doesn't matter if they pass it this year or next, because it's the General Assembly. And the idea being is that there is an election in between the two passages of that resolution. So they'd pass it now. The earliest they could then again act on it would be 2025, and then it would presumably appear on the 2026 general election ballot, when that would be an up or down vote for a majority of Iowans, and then it goes into the Constitution, assuming that it gets published correctly. So anyway, so that's what it takes. It is a long, arduous process. I do commend them for trying to seek out protections, future looking. I think it's a spot where we are at as a conservative movement. We've secured these series of conservative victories. What do we do to future-proof them? And I think sometimes that's going to involve some constitutional questions. So, well, good. Well, we are going to have more to say on that in the future. one thing, I'm going to tease out something that I want to talk about next week on the podcast, and we may have a special guest for this as well. But maybe it's my history as a legislator, or maybe it's as an attorney, but the Iowa Supreme Court had a decision that came down today as we record this on Friday, which was LS Power versus the state of Iowa, which had some language in it and some rulings on, well, titles of bills and single subject rule law. That doesn't really matter, but it did have, it borrowed on legislative floor debates, legislative history in a way that could potentially have a very serious impact on how the legislature does business. And so we're going to take a look at that some more in the future, but that's hot off the presses stuff. And I just kind of wanted to tease that out a little bit. But it's a ruling that on first blush, I think is very, very poorly thought through. So we're going to be talking about that. So with that,
and you thought that John and I weren't the right people to address that?
That is correct.
Okay, probably.
True.
It
goes back to the saying. What are two things that you don't ever want to see made?
Sausage and legislation?
Laws and sausage. So the Iowa Supreme Court decided to take a look at the laws part of that. And I frankly, I think they just misunderstand it and misunderstand their role in separation of powers. But we'll explore that more. So,
boy, speaking of separation of powers, Chris, nice segue to our second piece of the day.
Anyway, gentlemen, thank you. We're going to move on. We have a special guest here today in studio. We are joined with Daniel Dew from Pacific Legal Foundation. Greetings and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good. Well, I guess to start, usually I try to have something fun to do, or I make fun of John or something. So we don't have that, and I don't feel like I know you well enough to kind of make fun of you and try and get you laughing out of the gate. But tell us about yourself, your background, what you do.
Sure. So I work at Pacific Legal Foundation. We're a nonprofit law firm. We've been around for about 50 years now. We had 2 wins in the U.S. Supreme Court last term. We've got 3 more cases pending before the Supreme Court this term, so we're really excited about that. And a couple of years ago, we decided instead of just suing the government, we should probably work with them so our litigators don't have to sue them quite as often.
That's overrated.
And so that's what I do. I lead our policy team.
Great. And it's a national operation, right? You cover all 50 states?
Yeah, we're all over the place. Anywhere where people want to work with us.
Good. Well, we like that. I mean, we've had, and you may know Alan Ostergren, who we partner with here in the Kirkwood Institute. And so we've had him talking about strategic litigation is something that I know Iowans for Tax Relief does care about. We don't do it ourselves because at least myself, I don't want to practice law. That's why I'm with ITR. So anyway, we hold that to others. But I think that's great to actually try and engage in that process before it gets to the point of litigation. But what specifically brings you to Iowa today, and why do we have the privilege of hosting you here?
Yeah, one of our major issue areas is separation of powers. So just making sure that each branch is doing its proper function and no more, no less. And so there's this terrible doctrine started at the federal level called Chevron deference, our deference.
Yes, Chevron.
Where the courts, the courts they don't do their job. They don't say what the law is. Instead, they said, this is really complicated. So we're just going to let the agencies themselves who've written the regulations.
Yes.
We're going to just go with whatever they say it means.
Right.
And so we're trying to undo that through litigation and legislation. Yeah. And there's a great bill here in Iowa, House File 645, that would undo that.
Good.
At state level.
No, and so that bill, that has already passed the House, correct?
Yeah,
and so now it's over in the Senate. And so subcommittee this afternoon, and hopefully they can pass that out. When you talk about this, and as surprising as it is, not everyone pays attention to these things as closely as you or I might. But what is the criticism? What are the criticisms that you hear from agency deference or Chevron or whatever this is? What criticisms do you have to fight back against on trying to get one of these reforms done?
Sure. So the biggest criticism is they say that the agencies are the experts and the courts. I mean, we've run these types of bills in other states, and the testimony that's just so brutally honest.
Yeah.
Saying that judges, after being fully briefed, just won't understand what the law or the regulations required. But we're still going to hold people accountable for violating those, even though our judges can't understand it. We expect everyone else to.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's pushback. We actually had one group that was one set of agencies that was pushing back, saying we're actually going to have to hire more attorneys now because we're going to have to write our regulations more clearly, and that's going to take some attorneys to review these things. Yeah, exactly. So it's an admission, right? It's an admission that they're not already doing that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was reminded one time that I've always taken an interest in sort of the legislative administrative rules review process and how important that can be. And I was sitting through a presentation from a law professor once who was talking about how it really there shouldn't be that same level of legislative oversight over administrative rules because legislators can't understand this stuff, and that these are none of these are political decisions. Is that leave those political decisions up to the legislature, and these are the experts on this that ought to be writing these things. And every issue is political. It's just a matter of how small and nuanced it might be, right? There's always somebody that cares, and let's not pretend for a minute that the administrative branch folks that are promulgating these rules, that they aren't susceptible to political pressures themselves. They absolutely are working with people with different interests on a bill. And well, anyway, that's an aside from the bill itself, but we somehow, I just always say that to make sure that don't fall in this trap that these bureaucrats and agency folks are completely immune from political pressures and have everybody's best interest at heart, because it's not always the case.
Well, and just think about the terrible system. So Gary Lawson kind of has this famous quote amongst nerds, at least, talking about agencies and the whole process. So, the agency writes the regulation, the agency investigates any violations of the regulation, and then the agency decides whether they're going to prosecute it, and then the agency actually prosecutes it, and then the agency goes before the agency, and if they don't like the decision of the administrative law judge, they appeal it to the agency, and then the agency can change the determination to whatever they want to be. And then after all of that, that's when you get into court. Yeah. And then our courts just say we're going to defer to the agency. So it's you can see why it's a problem.
Yeah. No, it's exactly right. And our organization broadly is freedom from government, from specifically on tax policy, but we've been strong on regulation reform as well. And you hear from folks like everyone pays taxes. Not everyone is in front of an administrative law judge, right? But these things still matter. And look, if you're in front of that judge, it matters a lot, right? If this is government that's restricting you from whatever activity it needs to be. But freedom from government, it extends beyond just you individually, because this has a chilling effect on a whole lot of other things. Is that whatever your touch point with government is, you ought to be treated fairly, and the scale shouldn't tip in favor of government itself.
Yeah, I mean, so we all got a taste of this though during the pandemic. We lived in a world without separation of powers for a while. I don't know to what extent it was here in Iowa, but in Virginia, where I live,
you're done.
When I was where we live in Virginia, I mean, everything was closed down. It was one person deciding, who was essential, who wasn't essential, deciding which types of healthcare people could receive. Yeah. And the courts were shy about stepping in. Yep. They didn't want to, this is an emergency. We're not going to step on any toes. And so, people got a little bit of a taste of what it's like for industries and individuals who have to go up against agencies and just feel like nothing is in their control.
Yeah. No, we were incredibly fortunate in Iowa. I guess if nothing else, then that one person was Governor Reynolds, who was one of the leaders in the country in trying to keep Iowa open and free. And part of it was driven by, we had industries here, especially in our agricultural, that are absolutely critical, that if those industries fail, you can't shut down a livestock operation, because they need fed. the animals in it, and people need to eat. So, we had that benefit, but we stayed mostly open. And I think, yes, we had a lot of fights over vaccine mandates and the things that happen in other states, but our schools stayed open. Our businesses largely stayed open. And so we were immune from some of that you're talking about. But in other states, and we all know somebody that experienced this in a much more heavy-handed jurisdiction, is that it really opened people's eyes to just how quickly you can lose that freedom to government and how those decisions are made. So it's absolutely a righteous fight for you to be on to try and help do this. So I wanted to ask you, is this something that you're seeing states act on and move on, or similarly, are other states like Iowa where there is this deference, or are we unique in the need to do this bill?
No, most states have deference, and that's starting to change. So places like Arizona, Florida passed a constitutional amendment. Wisconsin, other states have passed legislation to stop this. Other places, the courts are stepping in and saying, we're not going to do this anymore. So Pacific Legal Foundation recently won a case in the Ohio Supreme Court where they overturned deference there. So there's starting to be this shift, and there's starting to be a shift at the federal level too. Mm-hmm. And so, hopefully the Supreme Court will overturn it there when it comes to federal regulation.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, it's as much as administrative law can get really wonky and really technical really quick. The issue around this bill is actually pretty simple and straightforward. And so hopefully you have a good subcommittee today. I know that Victoria is going to be there and arguing for that, and I think there's some other folks that are on the same side. The floor manager in the House is my law partner, so I think he's continuing to stay invested in the bill and trying to shepherd that through. And there's some great people in the state Senate that I know get these kinds of issues, and so I'm hopeful that we can get something done yet this year. And I appreciate you coming in. Anything else that the Iowa legal community or Iowa free market champion should be thinking about? Anything else on the horizon, or any other issues nationally that your organization are tracking? I put you on the spot, I know, but it's, is this the thing that PLF is working on, or give us a flavor of what some of those other, maybe we're ahead of the curve and we don't have to worry about so many things here, but do you have any other high profile issues that the organization works on? Yeah.
So no state is perfect when it comes to separation of powers. Yeah. And so what we try to do is look at it through the constitutional lens. Mm-hmm. And so when we're looking at reforms, are you having meaningful legislative oversight over the rulemaking process? Yeah. Is there executive accountability, meaning that instead of having low-level bureaucrats sign off on these rules that have the effect of law, somebody who's actually going to be accountable to voters? And then finally, judicial integrity, and that's where the current Iowa bill fits in. So that's what we're working on all across the country and trying to improve that all over.
Good. Well, at some point, I'd like to pick your brain about that legislative oversight of the rules process, because every state does it different, and there's light touch and heavy touch, and but yet it's a pretty critical part of the process that I've come to care about. Well, Daniel, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it. Folks, thanks again for joining us on ITR Live. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell your friends. And with all that, we will see you next time.